Arches National Park is a protected site located in eastern Utah. Covering a surface area of 310 square kilometers, it is known for its formidable number of natural rocky arches, and also for its cliffs and mounds sculpted by erosion. Located at the heart of the Colorado Plateau, at an altitude ranging between 1,200 and 1,700 meters, the park covers a semi-desert area that is mostly composed of red sandstone. These landscapes have inspired many film directors. For example, the first scene of the film Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade was shot here. And the desert scene of Star Wars Episode I drew inspiration from this landscape. The park presents surprising natural sculptures, where certain monuments seem to defy the laws of gravity. Here, 300 million years ago, a vast shallow sea occupied the region. In the hot and dry climate that reigned at that time, the great quantity of salt water trapped in this basin began to solidify. The layer of saline rock which formed reached a width of 1.5 kilometers in some areas. With time, the saline formation was covered in detrital sediment originating from the erosion of the nearby mountains. It is estimated that the layer of sediment which accumulated might have been greater than 1.5 kilometers thick. Thanks to the effects of water and the major thermal amplitudes on the red sandstone, the effects of erosion degraded the more friable layers, leaving the more resistant layers intact. The underlying zones, dug out by erosion, ended up creating a window that kept growing in size. Once the orifice attains a diameter greater than 1 meter, it is called an arch. There are more than 2,000 arches in the park. As the opening grows, the arch becomes more and more fragile and fine, and ends up crumbling, leaving only its base. Even though erosion was especially strong during the glacial period, it still continues today and constantly modifies the landscape. Recently, in fact, a block measuring 18 meters by 3 meters crumbled to the ground. In the park, a site called the Elephant's Parade bears its name well. A bit further away, Delicate Arch is the park's best-known monument. Measuring 20 meters high, it is represented on the license plates of the state of Utah, and the Olympic torch was carried below it for the Winter Games of 2002. Fiery Furnace is a group of narrow and labyrinthine canyons which contain interesting geological formations. Here, we can see the phases of erosion which are varied according to the more or less friable layers of sedimentation. Here and there, vestiges of collapsed arches show that the process is still underway. Landscape arch is undoubtedly on the verge of crumbling. Nearly 90 meters long, it is the second longest in the world. It is so dangerously slim that hikers are no longer allowed to walk below it. As we can see, Arches National Park, despite its seemingly eternal monuments, is in fact quite fragile. Made up of clusters of sediment, even sand, the rock crumbles over time. Built like a fortress, the Novodevichy Convent, whose name means New Virgin, is probably the most well-known monastery in Moscow. The convent was founded in 1524 by the Grand Prince Vasily III, son of Ivan III the Great, to commemorate the conquest of Smolensk from the Polish in 1514. The oldest building of the convent is the large Cathedral of Our Lady of Smolensk, with its 5 bulbed bell towers and its shrouded crosses. Its frescoes are amongst Moscow's most refined, and were made in a canonical and monumental style. For the most part, they date from the reign of Ivan IV the Terrible. The frescoes covering the walls and ceilings of the cathedral, despite their age, are the most well preserved in Moscow, which is what makes them interesting. The bell tower, 72 meters high and separate from the church, is the second highest edifice in Moscow. The cathedral is the focal point of the monastic complex, which also includes many other important structures, like the refectory and the Church of the Dormition, both built in 1686 during the regency of Sofia before her treason. The iconostasis here is also magnificent. In 1922, the Bolsheviks closed the convent and transformed it into a museum of art and history in 1926, which enabled it to escape destruction. At the entrance of the cemetery behind the cathedral, you can admire a small chapel that was built in the early 1910s for the rich Prokhorov family. Several members of the family are buried there behind rich mosaics instead of the usual frescoes. Like Moscow's other monasteries, Novodevichy Convent was chosen by Russian nobility as a burial place. At the time, you had to pay the enormous sum of 1,000 rubles to be able to be buried there. During the Soviet era, numerous tombs were destroyed. Only the people favored by the ruling powers saw their gravestones spared, like those who defeated Napoleon's troops and liberated Russia in 1812. Since then, numerous figures were buried there, like actors who are more or less famous. Soldiers, heroes of World War II, or Soviet dignitaries. The cemetery is truly a phone book of celebrities, and it is very moving to walk here beneath the foliage of the old trees. For many years, and rightly so, Moscow has held the title of Russia's capital of theater and music. And the Bolshoi Theater, the big theater, is its prestigious stage. The chariot of the pediment was carved by Peter von Jogensberg, and it even appears on the 100-ruble banknote. The theater was built in 1825 in a neoclassical style by the architect Joseph Beauvais, who also built the manège. The Bolshoi troupe was founded in 1776 by Pyotr Urusov and Mikhail Medox. In the beginning, the company put on shows in a small theater or in private locations. With its success in the opening of the Bolshoi Theater, the troupe decided to make its home there. While the Bolshoi Theater originally only presented Russian plays, operas, and ballet, starting in 1840, numerous foreign composers contributed to the expansion of its repertoire. The theater was the site of numerous historic premieres, including the famous ballet Swan Lake by Tchaikovsky on March 4, 1877, and even compositions by Rachmaninoff. Not far away, Café Pushkin is an aristocratic cafe restaurant opened in 1999 in the former home of Catherine II, the Great, who reigned at the end of the 18th century. It owes its name to the great Russian poet and is today one of Moscow's essential destinations for food lovers. The spirit of Café Pushkin is an authentic reflection of the cuisine of the 17th and 18th centuries in a context of the ambience of the era. In Moscow, the former ramparts of the city gave way to a great circular boulevards embellished by gardens. Along one of them, this Art Nouveau-style house, imagined by Franz Schechtel, is worth the detour, if only for its highly original architecture. After having been the home of a Russian billionaire, the writer Maxim Gorky lived there from 1931 to 1936, the year of his death. Maxim Gorky is a Russian writer considered one of the founders of socialist realism in literature. He was a politically and intellectually engaged man on the side of the Bolshevik revolutionaries. After a poor childhood, this autodidact went through journalism to become a famous writer for his picturesque stories portraying the miserable poor of provincial Russia. He was highly appreciated by Stalin. The house seems to have not moved since his death. The library is still very well stocked. His office was reconstructed nearly down to the pen. His collection of knickknacks is still presented, as well as his family photos. The site also served as a literary and artistic salon because Gorky liked to meet with representatives of other cultural groups. You can also admire the stairway and its stunning ramp in the shape of a wave that goes upstairs. The house is a unique example of the Russian architecture of the early 20th century. More prosaic but not without poetry, the Moscow Metro is famous for the decoration of its stations, some of which are truly works of art with murals, mosaics, chandeliers, stained glass windows, and marble. Its construction began in 1935, and it now contains 12 lines and 188 stations, uniformly serving nearly the entire city. With some 7 million passengers transported every day, it is the most frequented subway system in the world after that of Tokyo.
In Havana, the Plaza de Armas, the Square of Arms, is the oldest square and the historical heart of the city. This is where the first Mass was celebrated upon the city's foundation in 1519. And it's on this square that the parades and military exercises took place. Over the course of many centuries, it was the city's political and military center. The Central Park was fitted out in the 19th century, and many booksellers stand along its perimeter, selling books, magazines, old yellowed photos, coins and medals. In the middle of the park stands a statue of Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, the initiator of Cuba's War of Independence in the 19th century. Along one of the square's sides stands the former palace of Conte Santovenia, which became the Santa Isabel Hotel in 1867. Opposite the hotel on the park's western side stands the former Palacio de los Capitanes Generales, the palace of the colonial Spanish governors from 1791 to 1898, when Cuba attained its independence following the Treaty of Paris. Later, the building served various functions, from a prison to city hall, and including the presidential residence. Its patio is lined by a gallery of arcades, and it's overlooked by a sculpture of Christopher Columbus in Carrara marble. Today, the palace is a museum devoted to the city's history. At the heart of Old Havana stands the Plaza Vieja, the old square, which in the 16th century was called the New Square, Plaza Nueva. It was the market square where the greatest slave trade in the region took place, amongst other things. Some of the rich traders chose to establish their residence there in order to be closer to their business dealings. This explains the profusion of beautiful houses that surround the square. Turned into a parking lot before and during the Revolution, the plaza has since benefited from particular attention, for it's the greatest architectural complex of colonial buildings in all of Latin America. On the south side stands the house of the Count of San Juan de Arauco, built in 1737. It stands out by its tall stone arcade and its multicolored stained glass windows that fan out above the balcony's doors. On the east side, the Gomez Avila edifice is the tallest building on the old square. It has been transformed into a hotel. Beside it, the two-story blue house is the Casa de Esteban José Portier, built in 1752. It currently shelters a photo library. To its right, the planetarium was fitted out in an abandoned movie theatre, which reveals the sizable rooms that these buildings contain. The west side of the square is undoubtedly the most beautiful. The small palaces that line it nearly all display stained glass windows. It's worth noting that the stained glass windows are a characteristic element of Cuban architecture. A brasserie was established at its tip. A few steps from here, the Casa de Manuel Altuve was built in the 18th century. Divided up into multiple apartments after the Revolution, it has since been completely renovated. The former palace of Count Esteban de Cañongo stands out from the surrounding buildings by the verticality of the decorative elements that adorn its facade. On the north side, the restaurant Santo Ángel is established in the former palace of the Benítez de Pereiro family, built in the late 18th century. Part of its upper floor has been converted into a music conservatory. Over the past few years, the restaurant has become specialized in Cuban and international cuisine. To its right stands an elementary school whose facade is spectacularly beautiful. The school was established in a 19th century building that belonged to the Count of Mortera. But now it's time to leave the sunny old square for the cool and shaded alleys of Old Havana. Founded by the Spanish in 1519, the capital was a hub of trade and ideas. Throughout time, it's always attracted adventurers and intellectuals seeking exoticism. Not least among them, the American writer Ernest Hemingway, who resided at the Ambos Mundos, the Hotel of Both Worlds, between 1932 and 1939. It's a 4-star colonial hotel built in 1923. Today, it's one of the most famous hotels in the world because it housed the famous novelist. Close to the hotel, the Floridita Bar also plays a role in Hemingway's legendary figure. It's said that during his first visit here, he ordered a daiquiri, the house speciality. According to legend, after drinking it, he said, "Not bad, but I prefer it without sugar and double the rum." The barman then served him a second glass, saying, "Here you go, Papa." And his nickname was born. The Bodeguita del Medio is another bar that the writer frequented. He would drink mojitos there, the famous rum-based Cuban cocktail. Copacabana is known as being synonymous with paradise. The boardwalk, the calçados, motif of white and black waves, has become known worldwide, and it has become the symbol of a city associated with leisure and pleasure. Copacabana is at its best on Sundays when a part of the Avenida Atlantica is closed to traffic. Joggers, cyclists, culturists, surfers, volleyball players, street vendors and passers-by fill the roads, the beach and the sea. Rio has a tropical climate, so the average annual temperature is 24 degrees centigrade. Located in the southern hemisphere, its summer season lasts from December to March, while its winters last from June to September. In summer, the population can be counted by hundreds of thousands of beachgoers and vendors selling drinks, ice cream, sunscreen, hats, sandals, kites, swimsuits, soccer balls, volleyballs, walk up and down the beach. But Copacabana also hosts many events and celebrations. On New Year's Eve, huge fireworks are set off before nearly 2 million spectators, all dressed in white. As tradition requires, at midnight, flowers are thrown into the sea. Among the events which attracted the most people to the beach, a Rolling Stones concert on February the 18th, 2006 drew over 1 million people. On July 28, 2013, Pope Francis held Mass on the beach and over 3 million people participated. Copacabana's beach, running 4.5 kilometers along a perfect curve, is considered as one of the most famous beaches in the world. It's nicknamed the Princess of the Seas and is one of the city's tourist emblems.
Você bem que podia me aparecer nesses mesmos lugares, à noite, nos bares, onde anda você?
At one end of the beach, the small fisherman's corner seems unreal. Early in the morning, the small boats are pushed out to sea. Here there's no hoist, no sloped surface, just some boards and the strength of the men's arms. Under the trees, the nets are hung to dry, and a stand presents the day's catch. It's a surprising place and reminds us of how Copacabana was in the early century, when only a handful of villas dotted the dunes. Right next to it, Fort Copacabana is a military base that was built in the early 20th century on the ruins of an old chapel, in order to protect the city. In the 19th century, the country had undergone many political and military upheavals during the wars against Uruguay and Paraguay, as well as many naval battles against England, who were prowling around the newly independent nation. Open to the public today, Fort Copacabana shelters the Historical Museum of the Brazilian Army. The motto inscribed at the entrance reads, "If you want peace, prepare for war." On the boardwalk stand many pieces of artillery from the late 19th and early 20th century.
A gente trabalha o ano inteiro por momento de sonho pra fazer a fantasia de rei ou de pirata ou jardineira.
While enjoying the view, one can sip a caipirinha, the famous cocktail made with Brazilian rum, cachaça and lime. One can watch the changing of the guards, which has preserved its ceremonial pomp. On the other side of the fort's rocky promontory, Ipanema is the wealthy, trendy and chic district in the southern part of the city. It contains one of the most beautiful beaches of the world, stretching over 2.5 kilometers. As in Copacabana, on Sundays, motor traffic is halted on the street lining the beach. Sundays are a time for strolling, shopping, lazing about, or sunbathing. Here, Brazilian bathing suits are required. It's like a bikini, reduced to the strict minimum. 2 cloth triangles, one in the front and one in the back, tied together by a small string. Brazil sells 290 million of these bathing suits each year. Less lively, less noisy and less vast than Copacabana, Ipanema is undoubtedly the most romantic of Rio's 25 beaches. It's the meeting spot for the city's golden youth and for the homosexual community. Beyond its role as a meeting point, the beach is used to practice different sports, among them surfing and volleyball. The Château of Azay-le-Rideau is a classified monument and an architectural masterpiece of the first French Renaissance, whose image is known around the world. An earlier medieval castle had been built around 1120 by one of the knights of King Philip Augustus, who had a defensive fortress constructed. 300 years later, the medieval castle burnt down. The estate was then acquired at the end of the 15th century by the Berthelot family, who were the treasurers for Kings Charles VIII, Louis XII and Francis I. The new chateau was then built between 1518 and 1523 with the authorization of Francis I himself by Gilles Berthelot and his wife Philippa Lesbailly, who directed the construction in her husband's absence when he was alongside the king in Italy. The Renaissance chateau was built on the very foundations of the ancient fortress. It had a strategic location on the banks of the Indre, which was a commercial inland waterway. It had a ford, a moat, and a drawbridge. The new chateau kept this strategic position, which is reflected in its architecture. The Renaissance style chosen here alternates with the feudal references that are part of the decorations. This is why you can see traces of a rampart walk on the exterior walls and machicolations on the roof. All this is mixed with high roofs that are ornamented with tapered pepperbox turrets and long dormers, which give it the silhouette and reflection that are so famous. The main characteristic of the new dwelling is the decoration of the facade, which hides the ceremonial stairway that welcomes visitors as they enter the chateau. This stairway with straight banisters has 3 floors with twin bay windows that form loggias. There are stone sculptures of the original builders Gilles and Philippa Berthelot beneath the protection of the F of Francis I. The stairway leads to the noble apartments found on the first floor. Its coffered ceilings are decorated with medallions representing the chateau's builders. But after all these expensive works, Gilles Berthelot fell into disfavor and was forced to flee. The chateau then passed from hand to hand until the French Revolution. In 1791, damaged and abandoned, it was sold to Marquis de Biencourt, a liberal nobleman. All throughout the 19th century, many works would be carried out to restore it and make it habitable, and this is the state in which you will see it today. The restoration of the windows is a lovely example of the works that were carried out here. In the Renaissance era, they didn't know how to make cast glass in France. Spies brought the process back from Italy. In an office that's adjacent to the reception hall, a book on display exhibits a handwritten text by the first proprietor, which describes the works undertaken. The bed is displayed in a large Renaissance room. It was an important piece of furniture in the 16th century. It has curtains to protect it from passers-by, because the rooms are all in a row. There are no hallways. Kings Louis XIII and XIV slept in this room. Amongst the furniture is a cabinet made of blackened pear wood ornamented with ivory. And there is the original chimney. In a small room, there is a travel desk with false-bottomed drawers. This second room is also furnished in accordance with the inventory of the era. There are chests and tapestries from Brussels that date from the 14th century. These beautiful tapestries were meant to be decorative, as their colours were very vivid. But they also helped to keep out the cold and made the room cosier. And the same goes for the hangings on the distaff or columned bed. Next to the bed is a chair, the ancestor of the armchair. In the 19th century, at the time of the Biencourt, several salons were created. Here is a portrait of Henry IV, one of the kings of the Renaissance in France. The Biencourt kept all of their family's paintings. There are more than 300 in the chateau, and amongst the paintings of kings, there is Henry III's arrival in Venice. Truly a synthesis of the French art of building and the architectural innovations of Italy, the Château of Azay-le-Rideau is an authentic masterpiece of the First Renaissance. The Château clearly shows the association and blending between the French Gothic culture of fortified castles and the Italian culture of palaces. And this French Renaissance architecture is not a mere copy of Italy's. These elements of symmetry, order, regularity, and a grid layout will become customary for French architecture and will continue to be applied well after the Renaissance. Because of the beauty of its site, the Château of Azay-le-Rideau is perhaps the most romantic château of the Loire. The ancient city of Uxmal in the northeast of the Yucatán in Mexico is a typical example of one of the Mayan city-states that profited from the disintegration of the centers of power in the south and expanded during the late period at the end of the first millennium. The Pyramid of the Magician that overlooks the ancient city is the most imposing structure in Uxmal. It's an enormous mass of stone that is 35 meters high and supports a temple at its summit. It was there that the kings and priests performed trances and rites, including human sacrifices, in order to access the supernatural world and to converse with the gods. The levels of the pyramid are ovals rather than rectangles or squares, which makes this a building that's unique in the world. The Mayan pyramids also contained tombs, usually royal ones. By being entombed beneath the building, the rulers hoped to profit from the worship carried out in the temple above. Behind the pyramid, in its shadow, there's a building called the Quadrangle of the Birds. It consists of several buildings built around a courtyard. The House of the Birds takes its name from the sculptures that ornament the vestiges of this patio's walls, whose origins remain mysterious and evoke the feathered serpent god. The friezes on the walls are representations of the woven palm roofs that were typical of Mayan peasant huts. On the perimeter, there are several constructions, including this one with 13 columns and 4 rooms. According to archaeologists, the Quadrangle of the Birds might have been an administrative center for the city of Uxmal, which then turned into a religious place over the course of time. As is often the case, the structure was added to and expanded during several years. Further away, there is the Nunnery Quadrangle. It's composed of 4 palaces that surround a slightly trapezoidal patio. Its Spanish discoverers gave it this name because it bears a resemblance to Western cloisters. But here, these buildings would have served as a school for warriors, astronomers, and priests. Following the Puuc architectural tradition, the bareness of the lower walls contrasts with the rich ornamentation of the upper level, where trellises of stone mosaic separate symbolic reliefs which were once covered with stucco and painted with vivid colors. On the facade of the west building, 2 large feathered serpents hold human heads in their mouths. This representation certainly must have been made during the Toltec domination. The Nunnery Quadrangle could be considered a microcosmic ensemble, a group of buildings that represents the cosmos. The north building, the highest one, corresponds to the celestial world, and it's the most richly decorated. The lowest level, across from it, would be the underworld, and the east and west buildings, built at mid-level, would be the earthly world. Like almost all the pre-Columbian cities, Uxmal had a bull court. The bull game was a ritual sport whose goal was to symbolically help the sun in its daily course, as the sun is not an eternal star. It's born every morning and dies every night. Its arrival the next day is not guaranteed, and its ascension into the sky takes a lot of effort. It has a symbolic battle against the gods of hell, whom it fights every night. Here, the sun was symbolized by a ball that the players had to get through rings without letting it touch the ground. The game opposed two teams, and the losing team was sometimes sacrificed. Another building stands out. It's a portico with 11 columns. We don't know what role was played by this structure with its magnificent frieze. Basking in the sun, the Governor's Palace is unanimously recognized as the most accomplished masterpiece of Puc decorative architecture. In front of it, there is a stone monolith that is quite imposing. This large cylinder that was covered with stucco and painted with symbolic motifs had a function that remains a mystery today. Next to it, on a terrace that contained offerings and jewels, a two-headed jaguar served as a throne. The governor sat there listening to the grievances of his subjects. The palace was commissioned around the year 900 by Jacques, only sovereign of Uxmal who is still known today. It's 98 meters long and divided by two large, fine Mayan arches. The upper section of the facade is decorated with geometric patterns, masks of earthly monsters and figures. This mosaic with nearly 20,000 elements converges on the central statue of Chan. Located on the same terrace as the Governor's Palace, the House of the Turtles was built later. Rather than a temple, this structure seems to have been a civic building. It owes its name to the presence of the turtles on the upper part of its cornice, symbolizing rain and earth. Just behind the palace stands Uxmal's great 9-level pyramid. The square base of the building is 80 meters per side, and it measures 35 meters high. The temple on the upper platform can be reached by a large stairway and was named the Temple of the Macaws because of the carvings depicting these birds on its facade. The Pigeon House cluster is one of the oldest structures in Uxmal. It's a succession of 4 courtyards, some of which have buildings. Most of them are in ruins, but one of them has retained its great monumental facade with a stunning silhouette for which the Spanish conquistadors nicknamed it the Pigeon House. The entire site of Uxmal, therefore, is composed of several pyramids, temples, and various structures that are characteristic of Mayan civilization. Most of the buildings were made with carefully cut stones, which explains how well preserved they are and makes the site a remarkable vestige, giving us a glimpse of what a Mayan city might have been in its entirety. Avignon, a city in Provence region of the south of France, is of course famous for its bridge that every child knows thanks to the song they all sing. The Saint-Benezet Bridge was the border post between the French territory and the Papal state. As Avignon was nicknamed the City of the Popes because of the presence of the supreme pontiffs there between 1309 and 1423 for 114 years, during which Rome was prey to wars of succession and other divisions. The Palace of the Popes is thus a symbol of the Church's influence in the Christian West in the 14th century. Built starting in 1335, it's mainly the work of 2 builder popes, Benedict XII and his successor, Clement VI. And in total, a succession of 9 different popes resided in this palace fortress that was the largest Gothic structure of the Middle Ages. It's the fruit of the combined efforts of the great French architects Pierre Pessan and Jean de Louvre, who, through this structure, will elaborate on a Gothic style that existed in the northern regions, but was completely foreign to the south of France. The ensemble of this mass, with its towers that rise around 50 meters high, has a prestigious, powerful and massive architecture designed to impress the visitor and express the omnipotence of the power of the popes. In the grand courtyard, the Pope demonstrated his power and his prerogatives, and maybe this is what influenced Jean Vilar many centuries later, in 1947, when he created the Avignon Festival, one of the largest theatre festivals in the world. The courtyard continues to the powerful Tower of the Pope, where the Supreme Pontiff lived. Here in this room you can note the lovely decor that has a naturalist tendency, with great scrolls of oak and vine leaves against the sky blue background. It's a style of decoration that recalls the mosaics of antiquity. On the floor, tiles with floral, plant and animal motifs complement the decorations on the walls. The ceiling and the 4 master beams are also ornamented with floral and geometric patterns. In his desire to make Avignon a capital of Christianity, Clement VI wanted a space of great dimensions to dedicate to religious ceremonies. So his architect, Jean de Louvre, then raised up this great nave that measures around 50 meters long. It's a space beneath a ribbed vault with sculptural work that is rather simple but very elevated. They truly imported the Northern Gothic style, and the space will be dedicated to the major religious ceremonies that punctuate the liturgical calendar. Just next to this, there remains a small oratory, which was in fact dedicated to the low masses and very private services of the Pope. This small chapel is covered with frescoes dedicated to the lives of St. John the Baptist and St. John the Evangelist. They're the work of Matteo Giovanetti, a great painter of the Sienese school. For Clement VI, it was very important to evoke the lives of St. John the Baptist and St. John the Evangelist, as this was a theme that was very present in Rome. And as the ambition of the popes here was to impose Avignon as the new capital of Christianity, recalling Rome by the way of arts was a technique that they made great use of. In the court of the Supreme Pontiffs, there was a great effervescence, and its activity attracted a number of merchants, painters, sculptors and musicians who truly made Avignon into the laboratory of a new style. Another one of the palace's spectacular rooms is the Great Tinel, a name that indicates a dining room in the southern regions. But they will only eat here on major occasions, and the Pope sits against the rear wall. Above the vast room, there is a majestic framework that really looks like the overturned hull of a ship, which was coated with blue at the time, with a constellation of golden stars that stood out against it. In the back, a fireplace warmed the room. In the heart of the palace, there is the cloister, one of the first works built in 1335 during the reign of Benedict XII. This cloister makes it possible to organize the palace in a very functional manner, as all around it, there are the main buildings and services that govern pontifical life. This space is called a cloister, but it isn't used the way a cloister usually is, as we are in a palace, not a monastery. So its calling is not meditation, but rather logistics and communication. And the bell tower that overlooks it punctuated everyday pontifical life, in particular meal times, during which the palace was evacuated. The other important tower of the palace is the Wardrobe Tower. In the Room of the Deer, the Pope preserved a number of manuscripts, and it's a place where he meditated, thought, and worked. The magnificent decorative cycle on the walls was also in all likelihood created by Matteo Giovannetti. Here, around 360 uninterrupted degrees, we see a multitude of hunting and fishing scenes, like this one where they fish for pike in a breeding pond. Unfortunately, the scene of the deer hunt has almost completely disappeared. We can only see the back of the deer being caught by a dog. Another fresco shows a more aristocratic scene, one of falconry. The ceiling, contrary to that of the Pope's room, which has been remodeled and restored, is entirely of the era. It's truly a measure of naturalism. With its defensive military architecture and powerful towers, Palace of the Popes was used as an expression of the temporal and spiritual powers of the primary figures of Christian Europe, the popes. In the 14th century, the construction of this palace constituted the largest building site in the West, and the completion of the work symbolized the fact that the Pope at the time was the greatest of all the lords. And Avignon, once a small city in Provence, owes its fame to that century when the popes fled Rome to seek shelter here.